The council chamber of Xerion Prime fell silent as the emergency klaxons echoed through its crystalline walls. Ambassador Zethkar of the Vorthack Collective raised his six-armed form from the central speaking platform, his chitinous exoskeleton gleaming under the chamber's artificial suns. Around him, representatives from 47 different species sat in their designated sectors, their various forms of communication creating a symphony of clicks, whistles, and electromagnetic pulses that the universal translators struggled to interpret. The spatial disturbance readings are unlike anything we've encountered, Zethkar announced, his voice carrying the weight of genuine concern. The rift spans approximately 12,000 kilometers across 3 dimensions, and it's growing. High Council Meridian, her ethereal luminary form flickering with anxious golden light, leaned forward from her elevated position. What of our deep space monitoring stations? Surely they detected the formation process. That's what troubles us most, replied Captain Vexthal, the hegemony's chief military advisor. His reptilian features were set in a permanent scowl, made more pronounced by the stress of the situation. The rift appeared instantaneously. No build-up, no gravitational anomalies, no quantum fluctuations. It simply manifested. The chamber erupted in cacophony of concerned voices. The crystalline consortium's representative produced a harmonic frequency that translated as deep worry. The mechanical collective's drone emitted a series of rapid beeps indicating algorithmic confusion. Even the usually stoic void walkers seemed agitated, their shadowy forms shifting more rapidly than usual. Could it be a natural phenomenon? Asked Dr. Lythera, the council's chief xenobiologist, her tentacles weaving complex patterns in the air as she spoke. Perhaps a stellar collapse we failed to detect, or an exotic matter interaction? Zethkar's mandibles clicked in what his species considered a negative gesture. Our best theoretical physicists have run every simulation. The energy requirements alone would exceed anything we understand about natural cosmic forces. This appears to be artificially created. The implications hung heavy in the chamber's recycled atmosphere. In the 3,000 years since the Galactic Council's formation, they had encountered many species, absorbed some, defended against others, but never had they faced something that could manipulate space-time on such a scale. The ancients? Whispered someone from the back sections, and the chamber fell silent again. High Council Meridian's light dimmed to a pale amber. The ancients vanished 60,000 years ago. Their technology was impressive, but even they couldn't. What if it's not the ancients? Interrupted Dr. Kestai, the council's chief historian. His bulbous head pulsed with the bioluminescent patterns that indicated deep thought among his people. What if it's something else entirely? Something we've never encountered? Captain Vexthal's claws scraped against the metal of his seat. Unknown hostiles with reality-warping capabilities. Wonderful. Do we have any intel on what might be coming through? The rift is still expanding, Zethkar reported, consulting his holographic displays. But our long-range sensors are detecting massive gravitational signatures on the other side. Whatever's in there, it's big. How big? Meridian asked, though her tone suggested she wasn't sure she wanted the answer. Preliminary calculations suggest structures measuring several kilometers in length. Multiple contacts. They appear to be constructed objects, not natural formations. The chamber's atmosphere grew thick with tension. The hegemony had the most powerful military force in known space, but they had built their strength through conventional means. Plasma weapons, kinetic bombardment, energy shields. If they were facing opponents who could tear holes in reality itself, their technological advantage might be meaningless. I recommend full mobilization, Vexthal declared, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had commanded fleets for over 2 centuries. Every available ship, every defense platform, every orbital battery. We form a perimeter around the rift and prepare for whatever emerges. Wait, Dr. Kestai interjected, his patterns shifting to urgent yellow. Before we assume hostile intent, should we consider the possibility that this is a peaceful contact? Perhaps they're trying to communicate? Vexthal's laugh was a harsh, grating sound. Doctor, in my experience, species that announce themselves by tearing holes in space-time are rarely interested in peaceful dialogue. But what if they're refugees? Lythera suggested. What if they're fleeing something even worse than we can imagine? The thought sent a chill through the assembly. If beings with reality-warping technology were running from something, what did that say about the threat they were escaping? Movement detected, announced the chamber's AI system, its voice cutting through the debate. Objects are emerging from the rift. The main display screen flickered to life, showing the Deep Space Monitoring Station's feed. The rift hung in the void like a wound in reality itself, its edges crackling with energies that hurt to look at directly. And from its depths, something was emerging. The first thing they noticed was the size. The object was massive, easily dwarfing the largest vessels in the Council's fleet. Its hull was dark, angular, and covered in structures that seemed to serve no obvious purpose. Strange lights pulsed along its surface in patterns that suggested complex systems operating at full capacity. "By the void," Vexthal whispered, his usual composure cracking. "It's a ship, but it's impossibly large." "Look at the design," Lythera added, her tentacles quivering with excitement despite the danger. "Those aren't smooth curves like most spacefaring species prefer. It's all angles and edges, like it was built for war." More objects began emerging from the rift. Smaller vessels, but still massive by Council standards, taking up positions around the first ship in what was clearly a defensive formation. The unknown fleet hung in space like a gathering storm, their dark hulls reflecting the distant stars. "Incoming transmission," AI announced. The chamber fell silent as the display switched to show an empty communications channel. Static filled the audio systems, then slowly resolved into something that made every being in the chamber freeze in recognition. It was a voice, not the harmonic frequencies of the Luminari, not the clicks and whistles of the Vorthack, but something that spoke in mathematical precision, in emotional inflection, in the kind of communication that suggested not just intelligence, but passion. "This is Admiral Sarah Chun of the Terran Defense Fleet, commanding TDF Indomitable. We are responding to your distress signal. Please identify yourselves and your current threat status." The silence that followed was deafening. Then Dr. Kestai's bioluminescent patterns went completely white, the color of absolute shock among his people. "Impossible," he whispered. "It can't be them. They're extinct. They destroyed themselves 3 centuries ago." High Council Meridian's form flickered rapidly between colors as she processed the implications. "The humans," she breathed. "The humans survived." The emergency session had been called within minutes of the first transmission, but 3 hours later, the Council's leadership was still struggling to process the implications. In a secure conference room deep within Zirian Prime's governmental complex, the most powerful beings in known space sat around a table that had been designed to accommodate the physical forms of dozens of species. Today it felt far too small. "The historical records are clear," Dr. Kestai insisted, his bioluminescent patterns shifting through archives of data faster than most species could follow. "The humans discovered faster-than-light travel approximately 400 years ago. They expanded rapidly, establishing colonies on dozens of worlds. Then came the Great War. High Council Meridian's form had stabilized into a deep blue that indicated serious contemplation. The reports from our trading partners were consistent. The humans had split into factions, each claiming to represent the true interests of their species. The war consumed entire star systems. "We have sensor records," Captain Vexthal added grimly. "Worlds turned to glass, star systems stripped of all life-bearing planets. The humans didn't just fight each other. They fought with brutality that shocked even Hegemony's military leadership." Ambassador Zethkar's mandibles clicked in what his species considered deep thought. And then nothing. For over 3 centuries, complete silence from human space. No transmissions, no ship contacts, no evidence of continued civilization. We assumed they had completed their own extinction. "Clearly we were wrong," Meridian observed, her light dimming to a worried amber. "The question is, what have they been doing for 300 years? Dr. Lythera's tentacles weaved complex patterns as she processed the implications. Evolution rarely stops, even for sapient species. 3 centuries is enough time for significant social and technological development. The ship that emerged from the rift, it's beyond anything in our current databases. Beyond anything in anyone's databases," Vexthal corrected. I've consulted with military advisors from every major faction. The energy signatures we're detecting suggest power generation capabilities that exceed our theoretical maximums. And the rift itself, they created it, then traveled through it as if it were a conventional transport method. The implications were staggering. The Galactic Council had built their civilization on the assumption that they represented the pinnacle of technological achievement in this region of the galaxy. They had defensive capabilities that could protect against any known threat, diplomatic protocols that had prevented major conflicts for millennia, and scientific understanding that had unlocked the secrets of dozens of formerly extinct species. But humans had apparently developed technology that treated space-time itself as a navigational tool. We need to consider their intentions, Meridian said, her voice carrying the weight of someone who had guided interstellar politics for over 2 centuries. They said they were responding to a distress signal. What distress signal? The question hung in the air like a physical presence. The Council's communication networks were sophisticated enough to detect signals across dozens of light years, but they had registered no distress calls from any member species. Perhaps they're referring to something we haven't detected, suggested Ambassador Veltar of the Consortium, his crystalline form resonating with harmonic frequencies that translated as deep concern. Their technology is clearly more advanced than ours. They might be monitoring communication channels we don't even know exist. Or, Vextal added grimly, they're lying. The distress signal story could be a pretext for invasion. It's a classic military tactic. Claim you're responding to a crisis, then use that as justification for aggressive action. Dr. Kestai's patterns shifted to urgent yellow. But why would they need a pretext? If they can manipulate space-time, they have capabilities that make conventional military resistance meaningless. They could simply appear anywhere in Council space and do whatever they wanted. Unless they're not as powerful as they appear, Vextal countered. The rift required enormous energy expenditure. Perhaps they have limited resources, or the technology comes with significant costs they're trying to minimize. There's another possibility. Lythera interjected, her tentacles moving in patterns that suggested careful consideration. What if they're genuinely trying to help? The humans we encountered centuries ago were aggressive, yes, but they also showed remarkable protective instincts towards species they considered allies. Perhaps their nature hasn't changed as much as their technology. The room fell silent as each being processed this possibility. The idea that the humans might be attempting a rescue operation was both comforting and terrifying. Comforting because it suggested peaceful intentions. Terrifying because it implied the existence of a threat so severe that beings with reality-warping technology felt compelled to intervene. We need more information, Meridian declared. Dr. Kestai, I want you to compile every piece of historical data we have on human psychology, social structures, and military doctrine. Dr. Lythera, analyze their ship's energy signatures and try to determine their technological capabilities. Captain Vextal, prepare our fleets for any scenario. And the communication? Zethkar asked. They're still waiting for response. Meridian's light shifted to a determined gold. We respond. Carefully, diplomatically, but we respond. If they're here to help, we need to understand what they think we need help with. If they're here for other reasons, we need to determine their true intentions before they decide to act unilaterally. The secure communication channel was established within minutes, routed to the most sophisticated encryption systems the Council possessed. The transmission was sent with full diplomatic protocols, identifying the speakers and their authority levels within the Council's hierarchy. This is High Council Meridian of the Galactic Council, speaking on behalf of 47 member species. We were not aware that any distress signal had been transmitted. Could you clarify the nature of the crisis you believe you're responding to? The response came almost immediately, and the voice that emerged from the speakers carried undertones that the universal translator struggled to interpret. There was authority there, but also something else, a kind of weary determination that suggested the speaker had seen things that most beings couldn't imagine. Council Meridian, this is Admiral Chun. Our deep space monitoring stations detected quantum resonance patterns consistent with Devore reconnaissance activities in this sector. The pattern intensity suggested an imminent full-scale incursion. We've been tracking similar signatures for the past 18 months as they move through the Outer Rim territories. The conference room erupted in confusion. Half the beings present had never heard the term devourer, while the other half were frantically accessing historical databases to see if it matched any known threat classification. Admiral Chun, Meridian responded, her voice carefully controlled. We're not familiar with the term devourer. Could you provide additional context about this threat? The pause that followed was long enough to make everyone in the room uncomfortable. When Admiral Chen's voice returned, it carried a weight that made the universal translators emit harmonic frequencies, indicating extreme concern. Counselor, are you telling me that your species have never encountered the devourer swarms? That you've never had to defend against their harvesting operations? No, Admiral, we have not. Another pause, longer this time. Then, Council Meridian, I need you to listen very carefully. In approximately 72 hours, this sector is going to be invaded by a force that views all biological life as raw material for their expansion. They don't negotiate, they don't retreat, and they don't leave survivors. We came here to help you evacuate your population centers before they arrive. The words hit the conference room like a physical blow. Captain Vexthal's claws scraped against the table's surface as he processed the implications. Dr. Lythera's tentacles went completely still, while Ambassador Zekhar's mandibles clicked in rapid patterns that indicated severe stress. Admiral, Meridian said, her voice barely above a whisper, how do you know this? How can you be certain? Because, Counselor, we've been fighting them for 300 years. The war that you thought destroyed us? It was just the beginning. They found us, they attacked us, and we had to make a choice, evolve or die. We chose evolution. The silence that followed was filled with the sound of beings frantically accessing databases, trying to process information that challenged everything they thought they knew about human history and the nature of the galactic community. Admiral Chun, Meridian finally said, we need to meet face to face. There's clearly much we don't understand about the current situation. Agreed, Counselor, but we need to move quickly. The Devourer advanced scouts will be here soon, and once they arrive, diplomacy becomes irrelevant. Are you prepared to coordinate an evacuation of your core worlds? The question hung in the air like a death sentence. Everything the Council had built, everything they had achieved, suddenly felt fragile and temporary. We're prepared to discuss all options, Meridian replied, though her light betrayed the fear behind her diplomatic composure. Then we'll dock at your station within the hour. Fair warning, Counselor, you're about to learn why humans don't talk about the war that changed us. Some knowledge changes you, and there's no going back once you understand what we become. The docking bay of Zirian Prime's diplomatic station had been designed to accommodate vessels from dozens of different species, but no one had prepared for the sight of a human shuttle. The craft that emerged from the Indomitables Bay was sleek and dark, its hull covered in the same angular patterns that decorated the massive supercarrier. But it was a size that caught everyone's attention. The shuttle was larger than most Council frigates, and it moved with a fluid grace that suggested technology far beyond conventional propulsion systems. Admiral Sarachin stepped through the airlock with the confident stride of someone who had spent decades commanding starships, but her appearance shocked the assembled diplomatic team. Where the historical records showed humans as relatively fragile beings with short lifespans, Admiral Chin moved with the controlled power of someone who had been enhanced far beyond baseline human capabilities. Her uniform was clearly military, but it incorporated materials that seemed to shift and adapt to her movements, and her eyes held a kind of awareness that suggested cybernetic augmentation. Behind her came two companions who were clearly not entirely human anymore. One was tall and lean, with skin that seemed to shimmer with inner light, while the other was broader and more muscular, with what appeared to be metallic components integrated directly into a skeletal structure. Both carried themselves with the alert readiness of professional soldiers, but their enhancements were so seamlessly integrated that they seemed like natural evolution rather than artificial modification. High Council Meridian, Admiral Chin said, her voice carrying easily across the docking bay despite the thin atmosphere. Thank you for agreeing to meet with us. Meridian's luminous form flickered with complex patterns as she processed the visual information. Admiral Chun, forgive my directness, but you're not what we expected based on our historical records. I imagine not, Chin replied, a slight smile playing at the corners of her mouth. 3 centuries of warfare tend to change a species. This is Commander Torres, my science officer, and Lieutenant Morrison, head of my security detail. They volunteered to demonstrate some of our capabilities, if necessary. The casual mention of volunteering to demonstrate capabilities sent a chill through the assembled diplomats. Captain Vexthal's reptilian features shifted into what his species considered an expression of wariness, while Dr. Lythera's tentacles moved in patterns that suggested deep curiosity mixed with concern. Perhaps we should move to a more secure location, Meridian suggested, her light dimming to a more subtle level. There are many things we need to discuss. The conference room they entered was the most secure facility on the station, protected by multiple layers of shielding and equipped with the most advanced communication systems the Council possessed. But as Admiral Chun and her companions took their seats, the humans' casual disregard for security measures was obvious. They moved as if they were aware of every defensive system in the room and found them inadequate. Let's start with the basics, Chin said, placing a small device on the table. This is a tactical projector. It will show you what we're dealing with. The device activated with soft hum, and suddenly the room was filled with a 3-dimensional representation of space. Stars, planets, and shipping lanes appeared as tiny points of light, but dominating the display was a massive dark region that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. This is a Devourer front as it existed 6 months ago, Chin explained, her voice taking on the tone of someone delivering a military briefing. They've expanded approximately 15% since then. Each dark area represents a star system that has been completely harvested. No planets, no asteroids, no trace of the civilizations that once lived there. The scale of the destruction was incomprehensible. Entire sectors of space have been consumed, leaving nothing but empty void where millions of worlds had once existed. The Devourer swarms are unlike anything in our previous experience, Commander Torres added, his voice carrying harmonic overtones that suggested his vocal cords had been modified for enhanced communication. They're not a single species, but rather a collective intelligence that assimilates useful technologies and biological characteristics from the civilizations they consume. They adapt, Lieutenant Morrison said, his voice carrying the metallic undertones of someone who had undergone significant cybernetic enhancement. Every time we develop new weapons or defenses, they incorporate counters into their next generation of attack craft. Fighting them is like fighting evolution itself. Dr. Kestai's bioluminescent patterns shifted to urgent yellow, but surely they must have some weakness? Some way to communicate with them, to negotiate. Admiral Chen's expression grew grim. Doctor, the Devourer swarms don't negotiate. They don't communicate in any way we understand. They simply consume. When they encounter civilization, they study it, catalog its useful characteristics, then strip the system of all biological and technological resources. The process takes approximately 72 hours from initial contact to complete harvesting, and humans have been fighting them for 3 centuries? Captain Vextal asked, his voice carrying a note of disbelief. We've been adapting to them for 3 centuries, Chin corrected. The war that your records describe wasn't humans fighting each other. It was humans fighting the first Devourer incursion. We lost 70% of our population in the first year of contact, but we learned. The tactical display shifted, showing human space as it had existed centuries ago. Then, year by year, the display showed the systematic loss of colony worlds, the retreat to core systems, and finally something that shocked everyone in the room. The human territories began to expand again. How? Meridian asked, her light flickering with patterns that indicated deep confusion. How did you survive when civilizations with superior technology couldn't? We changed, Torres said simply. We enhanced our bodies, our minds, our technology. We became something new, and we learned to fight not just the Devourer swarms, but the weaknesses in ourselves that had made us vulnerable to them. Morrison leaned forward, his metallic components catching the room's light. The human military doctrine evolved beyond conventional warfare. We developed weapons that could adapt in real time, defenses that could modify themselves based on incoming threats, and personnel who could function in environments that would kill baseline humans. But the cost, Dr. Lythera whispered, her tentacles moving in patterns that suggested deep sadness. What did you have to sacrifice to become what you are now? Admiral Chin was quiet for a long moment, her enhanced eyes focusing on something beyond the room's walls. We sacrificed our innocence. Doctor, we sacrificed the luxury of believing that the universe was fundamentally safe, that intelligence and goodwill could overcome any obstacle. We learned that sometimes survival requires choices that change you so fundamentally that you can never go back to what you were. And now the Devourer swarms are moving toward Council space, Vextal observed, his voice carrying the weight of someone who was beginning to understand the true scope of the crisis. They've been moving this direction for months, Chin confirmed. Our long-range reconnaissance indicates that they've identified this sector as containing significant biological and technological resources. The quantum resonance patterns we detected suggest they're preparing for a major harvesting operation. The room fell silent as the implication sank in. The Galactic Council, with all its diplomatic achievements and technological advances, was facing an enemy that had forced humanity to evolve beyond recognition just to survive. What do you need from us? Meridian asked, her light shifting to a determined gold. Immediate evacuation of all non-essential personnel from your core worlds, Chin replied without hesitation. Mobile defense platforms repositioned to create overlapping fields of fire, and access to your manufacturing capabilities, so we can begin producing the weapon systems you'll need to have any chance of survival. And if we refuse? Vextal asked, though his tone suggested he was asking for information rather than considering the option. Admiral Chen's enhanced eyes focused on him with an intensity that made the reptilian officer step back involuntarily. Then in 72 hours, the Devourer swarms will begin harvesting your worlds, and within a week, 47 species will exist only in their collective memory banks. The choice is yours, Captain, but understand that this isn't negotiation. This is us offering you the chance to survive what's coming. The weight of the decision pressed down on everyone in the room. Everything they had built, everything they had achieved, suddenly hung in the balance of a choice they had never imagined having to make. Admiral, Meridian said, her voice steady despite the fear behind it. Show us what we need to do. Chin nodded, and the tactical display shifted again, showing deployment patterns, evacuation routes, and defensive configurations that would have been impossible for the Council to implement just hours earlier. But now, with the knowledge of what was coming, they had no choice but to try. The first thing you need to understand, Chin said, is that everything you think you know about warfare is about to become obsolete. The Devourer swarms don't fight like any enemy you've ever faced. They don't have supply lines to cut, morale to break, or political objectives to negotiate around. They simply consume everything in their path and adapt to overcome any resistance. The room's atmosphere grew heavy with the weight of impending change. In the space of a few hours, the Galactic Council had gone from believing they were the dominant force in their region of space to realizing they were about to become prey for something that had challenged the very concept of human civilization. But there is hope, Chin added, her voice carrying the confidence of someone who had faced the impossible before. We've learned how to fight them, how to survive them, and how to make them pay for every system they try to take. If you're willing to change, if you're willing to adapt as we did, then we can teach you to survive what's coming. The choice was no longer whether to change, but how much they were willing to sacrifice to remain themselves while becoming something capable of surviving the storm that was approaching. The evacuation of Zirian Prime began 18 hours after Admiral Chen's briefing, and it was unlike anything the Galactic Council had ever attempted. Massive transport vessels that had been used for routine cargo operations were hastily converted to carry refugees, while civilian ships of every classification were pressed into service. The sight of millions of beings fleeing their homes created a desperate urgency that permeated every level of the operation. But it was the human modifications to the Council's defense systems that truly demonstrated how far beyond conventional warfare the conflict had evolved. In the orbital shipyards high above Zirian Prime, human engineers worked alongside Council technicians to retrofit weapon systems that had been designed for traditional space combat. The results were disturbing to observe. Dr. Lythera watched through the viewport of the command center as a Council plasma cannon was systematically dismantled and rebuilt with components that seemed to pulse with their own inner light. Admiral Chun, what exactly are you doing to our weapons? Chun looked up from the tactical display, where she was coordinating the modifications across dozens of platforms. We're making them adaptive. Traditional weapons fire in predictable patterns. Energy output, projectile velocity, targeting algorithms. The Devourer swarms analyze those patterns and develop countermeasures within minutes of first contact. Commander Torres, who had been overseeing the technical modifications, turned from his console. Our weapons don't just fire projectiles or energy beams. They release self-modifying constructs that adapt their attack patterns in real time based on target responses. It's the only way to maintain effectiveness against an enemy that evolves during combat. The implications were staggering. The humans weren't just fighting with superior technology. They were fighting with weapons that could think, adapt, and evolve in the middle of battle. It was a level of sophistication that challenged basic assumptions about the nature of warfare itself. The targeting systems are particularly interesting, Torres continued, his modified voice carrying harmonic overtones that suggested enthusiasm despite the grim circumstances. Instead of locking onto physical characteristics, they identify quantum signatures unique to Devourer technology. Even when the swarms modify their hull configurations, the underlying quantum patterns remain consistent. Lieutenant Morrison approached from the security station, his metallic components reflecting the command center's lights. Admiral, the advanced scouts are beginning to probe our outer defensive perimeter. Estimated time to full contact, 43 hours. Chen's enhanced eyes focus on the tactical display, which showed the outer edge of Council space as a complex web of sensor networks and defensive platforms. Tiny red dots were appearing at the edge of the display, moving with a kind of purposeful coordination that suggested intelligence behind their movements. Show me the probe patterns, Chen ordered. The display shifted to show the movement of the Devourer scouts, and even the Council's military leadership could see that these weren't random reconnaissance flights. The probes were systematically testing defensive capabilities, analyzing response times, and mapping the locations of population centers with the kind of precision that suggested they had done this many times before. They're learning us, Captain Vextal observed, his reptilian features set in grim lines. Even their scouts are gathering intelligence for the main assault. That's exactly what they're doing, Chen confirmed. The Devourer swarms don't attack blindly. They study their targets, identify weaknesses, and then design their assault patterns to exploit those vulnerabilities. The probe phase usually lasts between 6 and 12 hours, followed by the main assault. Dr. Kestai's bioluminescent patterns shifted to urgent white. But if they're studying us, surely we can study them as well, learn their weaknesses. Morrison's expression grew grim. Doctor, we've been studying them for 3 centuries. They don't have weaknesses in the conventional sense. They have operational parameters, resource requirements, and tactical limitations, but they adapt to overcome any vulnerability we discover. Then how do you fight them? Meridian asked, her luminous form flickering with patterns that indicated deep concern. We don't fight them, Chen replied, her voice carrying the weight of hard-won experience. We survive them. We make the cost of harvesting our systems higher than the resources they can extract. We force them to adapt to us faster than they can integrate their modifications. And we never, ever try to fight them conventionally. The tactical display updated again, showing the human fleet deploying in patterns that defied conventional military doctrine. Instead of forming defensive lines or concentration points, the ships were spreading out in what appeared to be random formations, each vessel operating independently while maintaining some form of coordination that wasn't immediately obvious. Your fleet positioning doesn't match any strategic doctrine in our databases, Vextal observed, though his tone suggested professional interest rather than criticism. Because we're not deploying for a conventional battle, Chen explained. We're deploying for a survival operation. Each ship is equipped with self-sufficient life support, manufacturing capabilities, and enough firepower to operate independently for extended periods. If the Devourer swarms breach our primary defenses, every vessel becomes a mobile resistance node. The concept was revolutionary. Instead of trying to hold fixed positions or maintain supply lines, the humans had created a military structure that could continue fighting even after complete tactical collapse. It was a level of preparation that suggested they had learned to expect the worst possible outcomes and plan accordingly. But surely there must be some way to communicate with them, Dr. Lythera insisted, her tentacles weaving patterns that suggested desperate hope, some way to negotiate, to find a solution that doesn't require warfare. The silence that followed was filled with the sound of beings who had seen things that challenged their fundamental assumptions about the nature of intelligence and civilization. When Chen finally spoke, her voice carried the weariness of someone who had asked the same questions and learned the answers the hard way. Doctor, 30 years ago, we captured a Devourer Command node. It took us 6 months to decode their communication protocols, and another year to establish a dialogue interface. We spent 3 years trying to communicate with them, try to understand their motivations, their goals, their concept of existence. And what did you learn? Meridian asked, though her light had dimmed to a worried amber. We learned that the Devourer swarms don't consider individual biological life to be truly alive. To them, consciousness is just a complex chemical reaction that produces useful information. They don't see harvesting civilizations as destroying life. They see it as optimizing resource utilization. They were genuinely confused by our attempts to negotiate for survival. The implications hit the assembled council leadership like a physical blow. They were facing an enemy that didn't just refuse to negotiate. They literally couldn't understand why anyone would want to negotiate instead of simply accepting optimal resource allocation. They offered us a choice, Commander Torres added, his modified voice carrying harmonic undertones of remembered trauma. We could surrender our biological independence and join their collective, retaining our consciousness as information patterns while contributing our knowledge to their expansion. Or we could continue to resist and be harvested along with our resources. Obviously, we chose resistance, Morrison concluded, his metallic components reflecting the command center's lights. But the conversation taught us that we were fighting something that operated on fundamentally different principles than any form of life we had previously encountered. The command center fell silent as the weight of this revelation settled over the assembled beings. They were not just facing a military threat. They were facing a form of intelligence that considered their very existence to be an inefficient use of resources. Admiral, Vexthal said, his voice carrying controlled tone of someone who was processing information that challenged his entire worldview. What do we need to do to survive this? Chen looked around the command center, her enhanced eyes focusing on each member of the council leadership in turn. You need to accept that the universe is more dangerous than you ever imagined, and that survival sometimes requires choices that change you so fundamentally that you can never go back to what you were. But we'll still be ourselves? Meridian asked, though her flickering light suggested she already knew the answer. You'll be what you need to be to survive, Chen replied. The question is whether you're willing to pay that price, or whether you'd rather face extinction as you are now. The tactical display updated one final time, showing the Devourer advance scouts beginning their final approach toward the Council's core systems. The time for philosophical debate had ended. Now came the test of whether the Galactic Council could adapt quickly enough to survive what was coming. All stations, this is Admiral Chun, came the announcement over the command center's communication system. The Devourer main force will be here in 36 hours. Final preparations begin now. The Devourer main force arrived not as ships, but as a living darkness that seemed to consume light itself. The massive swarm stretched across thousands of kilometers, individual vessels flowing together in patterns that suggested collective intelligence rather than traditional military formations. Each craft was different, adapted from the remains of civilizations that had been consumed during the swarm's expansion across the galaxy. Admiral Chin stood in the command center of the Indomitable, watching as the enemy force deployed with the kind of tactical precision that had evolved over millions of years of conquest. Around her, the bridge crew moved with the enhanced efficiency of beings who had been modified for optimal performance under stress. Their movements were fluid, their responses instantaneous, and their coordination perfect in a way that baseline humans could never achieve. Devourer forces are establishing harvesting positions around all major population centers, reported Commander Torres, his modified voice carrying harmonic overlays that provided multiple data streams simultaneously. They're not attacking yet. They're preparing for systematic resource extraction. Confirmed, added Lieutenant Morrison from the tactical station. They're deploying mining platforms, biological collection arrays, and what appears to be consciousness extraction equipment. They're planning to harvest everything. The view screen showed the orbital space around Zirian Prime, where massive devourer constructs were taking position like predators surrounding wounded prey. The structures were clearly artificial, but they move with organic fluidity, adapting their configurations in real time based on the defensive responses they encountered. Council forces are reporting complete sense of disruption, Morrison continued. The devourer swarms are emitting some form of interference that's making conventional targeting impossible. Chen's enhanced eyes focus on the tactical display, where human vessels were maintaining their dispersed formation, while Council ships struggled to coordinate their responses. That's expected. They analyzed our defensive capabilities during the probe phase and developed countermeasures. Traditional weapons will be ineffective within the first few minutes of combat. On the communication channel, High Council Meridian's voice carried the strain of someone watching her civilization face extinction. Admiral Chen, our weapon systems are failing to achieve target lock. We're essentially firing blind. Switch to the adaptive targeting systems we installed on your modified platforms, Chen replied, her voice carrying the calm authority of someone who had faced this enemy before. Remember, you're not trying to destroy them. You're trying to make harvesting your resources more expensive than leaving you alone. The battle began not with the dramatic exchanges of conventional warfare, but with something far more disturbing. The devourer swarm simply began to dismantle everything they encountered, breaking down ships, stations, and even asteroids into component molecules that were then processed and absorbed into the collective mass. They're not fighting us, Captain Vexthal observed from his position aboard the Council's flagship. They're eating us. That's exactly what they're doing, Chen confirmed. The devourer swarms don't view this as combat. They view it as harvesting. They're processing our defensive efforts as environmental hazards to be overcome, not as military opposition. The human fleet began to move, their vessels flowing through space with a kind of coordinated precision that suggested they were operating as a single organism. But instead of engaging the enemy directly, they were creating patterns of movement that seemed designed to confuse and disrupt the devourer formations. Human vessels are not engaging the enemy, Morrison reported, his metallic components gleaming as he processed multiple data streams. They're hurting them? We're manipulating their harvesting patterns, Chen explained. The devourer swarms are efficient, but they're also predictable. They always choose the path of least resistance when extracting resources. We're creating artificial resistance patterns that force them to expend more energy than they can recover. The tactical display showed the results of this strategy. Devourer vessels that had been moving in optimal harvesting patterns were being forced to adapt to changing conditions, burning through energy reserves faster than they could replenish them. It was like watching a predator being slowly exhausted by prey that refused to behave according to natural patterns. It's working, Dr. Lythera reported from the science station. Their energy signatures are fluctuating. They're having to adapt faster than their systems can integrate new modifications. But the cost was becoming apparent. Council vessels that had been equipped with human adaptive systems were performing better than expected, but they were still taking massive casualties. The devourer swarms might be operating inefficiently, but they were still overwhelmingly powerful. Admiral, Meridian's voice carried over the communication channel. We're losing ships faster than we can replace them. At this rate, we'll be completely overwhelmed within hours. Chen's expression remained calm, but her enhanced eyes reflected the weight of decisions that most beings could never imagine making. Counselor, I need you to authorize the final modification protocol. It's the only way to generate enough resistance to make them consider withdrawal. What does that involve? Meridian asked, though her flickering light suggested she already feared the answer. We're going to have to enhance your personnel to operate at our level of efficiency. It's a one-way process. They'll never be able to return to their baseline forms. But they'll be able to interface directly with the adaptive systems and coordinate responses in real time. The silence that followed was filled with the sound of civilizations making choices that would change them forever. The enhancement process that had taken humanity centuries to develop would have to be implemented in hours. With volunteers who understood they were sacrificing their original forms for the possibility of survival. Do it, Meridian said, her voice carrying the weight of decision that would reshape her entire species. Whatever it takes. The modification chambers aboard the human vessels had been designed for emergency battlefield enhancements, but they had never been used on non-human physiology. Dr. Lythera was the first to volunteer, her tentacles already beginning to show the metallic threading that would allow her to interface directly with the adaptive weapon systems. The integration process is intense, she reported, her voice carrying new harmonic overtones as her nervous system adapted to the enhancement technology. But I can feel the weapon systems responding to my thoughts. It's like having a conversation with the ship itself. Similar reports came from volunteers across the fleet, beings who had spent their entire lives operating within the limitations of their baseline physiology were suddenly able to think and react at speeds that matched the human-enhanced personnel. The effect on combat effectiveness was immediate and dramatic. Devourer forces are showing signs of tactical confusion, Morrison reported. They're having to adapt to resistance patterns that are changing faster than their collective intelligence can process. The tide of battle was shifting, but not in the way anyone had expected. Instead of achieving victory through superior firepower or tactical brilliance, the combined Human Council force was winning through sheer adaptability. They were changing faster than their enemy could analyze and counter their modifications. Energy expenditure rates are now exceeding resource acquisition rates, Torres reported. The Devourer swarms are operating at a net loss for the first time in recorded history. Chin allowed herself a small smile. They're about to learn what we learned 3 centuries ago. Sometimes survival requires choices that change you so fundamentally that you can never go back to what you were. The Devourer swarms began to withdraw not in defeat, but in what appeared to be a calculated decision to seek more efficient harvesting opportunities elsewhere. They had encountered resistance that made the cost of conquest higher than the value of the resources they could extract. Admiral, Vexthal's voice carried the strange harmonic overtones of someone who had undergone the enhancement process. They're leaving. We survived. Yes, Chin replied, her voice carrying the weight of someone who understood the true cost of survival. You survived. But look at what you had to become to do it. The aftermath of the battle showed the transformed nature of the victory. The beings who had volunteered for enhancement were no longer the same species they had been hours earlier. They had gained capabilities that made them more effective, more adaptable, more able to survive in a universe that was more dangerous than they had ever imagined. We're not the same as we were, Meridian observed, her light now pulsing with patterns that incorporated the new harmonic frequencies of her enhanced neural systems. We can never go back to what we were before. No, Chin agreed, you can't. But you're alive, and your civilizations continue to exist. That's what matters in the end. The human fleet began to disperse, their vessels moving back toward the rift that had brought them to Council space. But they left behind something more valuable than military protection. They left behind the knowledge that survival was possible, even against enemies that seemed impossibly powerful. Admiral, Dr. Lythera called out, her enhanced tentacles operating the communication systems with fluid efficiency. Will you be returned to fight the Devourer swarms in other sectors? Chin paused at the threshold of the command center, her enhanced eyes focusing on the transformed beings who had chosen adaptation over extinction. That's what we do, Doctor. We find civilizations that are facing the same choice we faced centuries ago, and we give them the opportunity to survive. The universe is more dangerous than most species realize, but it's also more full of possibilities than they can imagine. As the human vessels disappeared back into the rift, closing the spatial disturbance behind them, the transformed members of the Galactic Council began to process the implications of what they had become. They had survived an encounter with an enemy that should have been impossible to defeat, but they had paid a price that changed the very nature of their existence. The myth of human extinction had been replaced by the reality of human evolution, and in learning to survive alongside humanity, the Council had evolved as well, becoming something new, something stronger, something capable of facing a universe that was far more dangerous and far more wonderful than they had ever imagined. The war was over, but the real journey was just beginning. In adapting to survive the Devourer swarms, both humans and the Council species had discovered that the greatest enemy was not external threats, but the limitations they placed on their own potential for growth and change. They had learned that survival sometimes required becoming something you never thought you could be. And in that transformation, They had found not just the strength to survive, but the wisdom to help others make the same choice when their time came to face the darkness between the stars.